Hi everybody, I'm Ty Landrum. I'm here at the Purple Valley Retreat Center in Goa, and I want to talk to you a little bit about how to use the diaphragm in backbending. So, the importance of using the diaphragm in backbending is the importance of getting axial extension. Axial extension is length through the central axis of the body. If you imagine the spine, the bones of the spine being like blocks, and you imagine what needs to happen for the spine either to bend very deeply, or to flex very deeply. Either way, the more space you can get between the bones of your spine, the more space you're going to have for that extension or flexion movement without compressing the tissues between the discs or the tissues that mediate the movement of those two bones with respect to each other. And so that will translate into a more easeful back bend. It will also translate into a greater range of motion, because if the bones are too close to one another and you start to try to bend them with respect to each other, at some point they're going to sort of, bottom out, or maybe your spinous processes, those bony protrusions that come off the end of your back, can also kind of, land bone on bone and prevent you from going deeper into your back bend. Whereas sometimes if you're able to create a little bit more space and then move, then you can access a much deeper range of motion. Okay, so I'm joined here by a guy that we just found on the street up at the top of the retreat center. So he's never heard of yoga. He's never done any yoga before, but we promised him lunch in exchange for his participation in this video. So we're going to show you that I want to show you, first of all, that the way that you need to use the diaphragm in backbending is something that you can already intuitively do. And to demonstrate that, we're going to use this gentleman who just heard of yoga about 20 minutes ago. Okay, so if you would please, Chris, come up onto your knees. So imagine this is a position for which you'd take like Ustrasana, the camel pose, for example. But Chris, if you would please, take a deep breath in and make yourself as tall as possible. Beautiful. So look how tall he is. Now, keep all of that height and take an exhale. Beautiful. So notice that he can do it. And I'm sure that you can too if you're trying this at home. You can take a deep breath, get quite high, make your spine long, and then inhale without losing any of that height. Okay, so now if you would please just relax, go back to a kind of neutral state. And now see if you can get all of that same length with the next exhale. And notice that nothing happens, right? He doesn't expand, he doesn't grow taller, right? It's the inhale itself that's helping to lift his rib cage away from the pelvis. So one way of thinking about that is that the diaphragm itself is pressing down on the abdominal viscera. Now the diaphragm its movements aren't extraordinarily large, but the effect of the diaphragm pushing down on the abdominal viscera can be quite pronounced. So the diaphragm is shaped like an upside down bowl, and its lower perimeter is attached to the lower perimeter of the rib cage, right? So when its fibers contract, it pushes down, on the organs that are below it, right? And if those organs are being held taut, then there's nowhere for the rib cage to go but up as the lungs fill with air. So what we've seen so far, that it's the downward motion of the diaphragm, the motion that draws the breath into the lungs, and indeed the inflatings of the lungs itself, that lifts the rib cage up when it's lifted. So you have to find that axial extension on the inhale, and you have to use the diaphragm to do it. But now, Chris, if you would please, take a deep breath in, get as tall as you can. So look how tall he is now, right? So long through the spine. So this is a great place from which to arrange the back bend. So now if you would, exhale, don't lose any length, just as before. Beautiful. Now inhale again. And now this time, exhale, don't lose any length, but completely release your belly. And notice that he shrinks, right? He can't stay high if he completely releases the belly. So that's telling us that the diaphragm and some engagement in the belly have to work in concert so that you can keep axial extension in the spine throughout the whole cycle of breath, right? And again, that's essential to backbending, because if you go into a backbend and then you suddenly release the engagements in the diaphragm and the low belly that are keeping the spine long, then you're going to suddenly experience a very unpleasant crunching sensation in the spine, which is a very familiar experience, of course, right? So one thing to notice is that if you're trying this at home, or if you're like our volunteer who just came off the street and never did any yoga before, that intuitively he knows how to hold the belly to keep the length through the spine, even as he's exhaling. And you'll find if you do this little exercise, this little experiment, you'll find that you do too, even if you don't know how to articulate what that engagement is. So now what I'll do is I'll kind of spell it out for you. I'll give you a sense of what it is that you're intuitively doing when you're keeping that axial extension throughout the whole cycle of breath. And then you can apply that to your backbends to really great effect. Okay? So there's a sling of muscle that connects the back of the diaphragm, right, which is more or less just the back of your rib cage, to the pubic bones. And those fibers, these are the fibers of the external obliques. They wrap this way. They come from the back of the diaphragm and then forward and down to the very front of the pelvic bones, right? So if he's toning through the external obliques, as he clearly is, then his belly is going to be kind of pushed up into the bowl of the diaphragm in such a way that when the diaphragm pushes down, that abdominal viscera doesn't move. It doesn't just go outward in the way that it did when he completely released. So if you would completely release again and exhale, and see how my hand moves out, his belly sort of falls. Instead, what he was doing intuitively is he's keeping his belly lifted by using the external obliques, right? And probably using the very lowest band of the transverse abdominis, which is right about at the level, at the waistline of his shorts, right? The waistband of his shorts, right at that level, right across the front of the pelvis, he's also engaged. And so that's keeping the belly itself, which is not hard. He's not tensing here. Here it's relatively soft, but he's toning on the sides and underneath the belly to lift the belly up into the bowl of the diaphragm. Yeah? And then when he does that, so there's a sense of the watery edges of the diaphragm pushing down on the belly, pushing down on something firm, and then there's nowhere for the rib cage to go but up. And that gives him axial extension. So if you could one more time, that gives him this beautiful lift. Now, if you could just hold that as you're breathing. So whether he's inhaling or exhaling, he's keeping all of that length. And he's doing it, again, by keeping the external obliques and the lowest band of the transverse abdominals engaged. He's not engaging here because if he did, that would really interfere with the quality of his breath, because the upper fibers of the rectus abdominals interdigitate with the front of the diaphragm. So if he tones there, if he tries to knit his ribs together and he squeezes his upper belly, then the breath itself is going to become really labored, and also the spine itself will be less supple. There's a kind of tenseness to that, isn't there? Like if you tried to backbend and kept that squeezed and short in that way, well, you wouldn't get too far, no? Right? Mm-hmm. Right? So the rectus abdominals, they really have to open up, right? They're going to get very long, right? And so you're allowing them to get long by not squeezing them too much. Okay, so then the other thing that he's intuitively doing is keeping his diaphragm toned, sort of as if he were inhaling, even as he's exhaling, okay? And you can see it, so it keeps it nice and broad, it keeps it nice and wide. Of course, there are other muscular mechanisms, including what's happening in the intercostals here, that are keeping the rib cage broad. But if he takes a deep breath in, take a deep breath in, right? And see how the rib cage is so expanded. And then he's going to exhale, but he's going to keep it expanded, and he's going to keep high. And so I don't know if you can hear it, but he's not exhaling. It's not like his deepest exhale. He's kind of staying more connected to the inhale phase of the breath. And that's what's keeping the crown of his head so far away from the pelvic floor. And with all of that, he's got great axial extension. Okay? Now it's important, again, to emphasize, and that's why I was joking about him being just off the street, that you already intuitively know how to do this, right? Because if I just describe it in terms of these sort of muscular engagements, it would sound like, something that you couldn't do, right? So engage your external obliques in the lowest band of your transverse abdominals, and then hold your diaphragm taut as if you were inhaling, even while you're exhaling. It would sound like, seriously, right? Like, how are you going to do that, right? But it's just a description of something that you already know how to do intuitively. And then the idea is that you need to sort of cultivate the ability to sustain those movements even as you're going into a back bend, even as you're doing something like Ustrasana, right? So there's a tendency in Ustrasana, if you'd come back up to your knees, really in any back bend, to lose that axial extension, perhaps simply because you're imagining in your mind that you need to make the back of the body, the back of the spine, quite tight, right? So there's a tendency, for example, if you don't mind, if you could show us kind of going back and, the way that people sometimes just dropping the rib cage down, right? In a way that it can feel quite crunchy on the lower back. So then come back up. So he's just not very long. He's not nearly as long as he could be right here on the part of his spine that bends the most, right? So instead, what he's going to do, he's going to take a deep inhale. He's going to use the diaphragm and those muscular engagements that we described. He's going to keep pushing his hips forward. And then even as he's going back, see, he keeps the back of the diaphragm super high, right? And then there he is. And see how long the spine stayed, even as he made the transition into the form. And that super long spine is translating it's creating a flow of support from the earth, from the legs, all the way up to the altar of the heart. And then from there, even further up and out. So he's got a good flow of stability, a good flow of that grounded energy of the earth that's coming up, and that's giving him a feeling of being supported so that the spine can really sort of open out. So that's wonderful, Chris. Thank you. And then you can come back up. Yeah. So one more piece of advice on back bending, and of course we're just working with Ustrasana here, but what I'm telling you about the way to engage the diaphragm and engage the lower belly will work with any back bend whatsoever. And I also want to tell you about a certain way of working with the musculature even deeper in the pelvis in a way that Chris indeed is already doing, but he's quite a seasoned practitioner. But I'll describe for you what he's doing and maybe point it out. And this will really bring the certain vibrancy and ease into the back bends. So what I have in mind, Chris, especially, is the way that you're pushing the pelvis forward and yet dropping and pulling the pubic bones back at the same time. So this creates a sort of sense of, if you would come back, a sense of the femur bones themselves spiraling inward like this. So he's going to push his hips as he starts to go back. The first time when he was showing you what it's like when he just sort of drops his rib cage and goes back, his pelvis went way back and his belly shortened. So instead, he's going to lengthen, he's going to lift the rib cage super high, then his pelvis goes forward as he's going back, right? But even as his pelvis is going forward, there's a sense of reaching the pubic bones down, even as the heart is moving away. So the pubic bones and the heart are moving away from each other here. And that's part of what's giving him more axial extension. And then this pressing forward of the pelvis is creating almost a narrowing on the front of the pelvis. And that narrowing helps him to soften the backside so that the sitting bones are moving out away from each other so that the sacrum can just float right in the middle. And with that floating sacrum, the dropping pubic bones, the spine that's reaching far that way, there's so much supportive energy flowing upward through the posture and, giving him a sense of remaining very grounded in this very opening, very expansive posture. So that's just beautiful. Thank you so much, Chris. And I hope that these tips, as elusive as they can be, indeed, these are things that you'll need to cultivate with considerable practice. But if you keep attending to them and keep trying to bring them into form, they eventually will materialize, and your backbends will be strongly enriched thereby. So thanks so much for listening. Thanks, Chris, for your help, and namaste.